So there is a song that I learned when I was a little girl that goes something like this. Oh, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. For the Father up above is looking down in love. So be careful, little eyes, what you see. Right? Do you remember that song from Vacation Bible School? And then we would go on and on and on. There were like 100 verses, right? And one of them was, oh, be careful, little mouth, what you say. And this becomes an important lesson for children, particularly in Vacation Bible School when we were prone to fight with one another as we were wiggling together on little carpets in little classrooms and trying not to spill our Kool-Aid all over. It was really important for our Vacation Bible School teachers and Sunday school teachers to teach us to use kind words, much like Pastor Don talked about with sticks and stones with the children. We know that kids have a tendency to do name calling and to bully on the playground, and we work really hard these days in the elementary schools to do anti-bullying campaigns and to work really hard so that we all use kind words and not wounding words. And yet, when we really think about it, we realize that these are not just childish temptations, right? It's not like long ago and far away, once upon a time, I used to say bad things, but when I grew into adulthood, I never ever thought or said bad things again. Because even if we don't yell out stinky head or other names on the playground, we still think those things, perhaps. We still have that temptation to gossip about others. We still feel the pain of wounding words just as sharply as in adulthood as in childhood. And so we need to, as we talked about several weeks ago, teach our minds to be careful what they think, but we also need to teach our mouths to be careful what they say. So in our series, we've spent a lot of time talking about how to change our lifestyles. We've been learning how to break busy so that busy doesn't break us. And we have talked about how to think about relationships and our thoughts and our time and all sorts of things. And this week, the topic is communication. And Allie Worthington, the author of the book, says this about communication. She says, developing good communication skills might seem like a strange way to break busy. You might not think of improving your communication skills as a good time management sort of strategy, and yet, she says, we need to consider the following questions. Number one, how much time have you wasted in gossip that only made you feel more anxious and insecure? She describes this for quite some time about how the more we vent and we think that we're just getting those feelings off of our chest, but the more we do that, the more those feelings get locked inside and we stress over them and we worry over them, and they become this presence in our lives that just gives us more anxiety and more insecurity. So gossip really doesn't help at all. Then the next question, how much time have you lost on fruitless arguments? Sometimes we argue and argue and argue about the same thing over and over again. I'm just going to tell you, you're never going to convince Pastor Don to like the Cardinals. You're not going to do it. It's a fruitless argument, right? And we don't need to waste our time on fruitless arguments. So sometimes we argue and argue and argue about silly things. I'm never going to convince my husband to become a Methodist. He's locked in as a Presbyterian. And those are things that just happen. But and some arguments are worth arguing for, but some we just waste our time on. The next question she said is, how much time have you spent wishing others understood you? And this comes from under-communicating. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But sometimes we think that we've communicated clearly and we didn't. And then we waste a lot of time thinking, Why doesn't he take out the trash for me? Or why didn't they do what I asked them to do? And perhaps the answer is you never really asked them to do that. You see, sometimes just because people can't read our mind doesn't mean that they don't care about us, right? And so we need to be able to communicate better. Then the last question about time wasting is, how much time have we frittered away? That's Worthington's phrase, but it's a fun one. How much time have we frittered away with talking too much, but are completely unaware of it? Or maybe you're the one that talks too much. So all of this is to say that taking a good look at how we communicate and why we communicate that way helps us to figure out our fast-paced world and cut the busy out of our lives. Reminding our mouths to be careful what they say is an important part of breaking busy in our lives. So today our scripture text comes from Colossians chapter 3, and it's a beautiful passage that tells us how to live faithful lives and cast off all that keeps us from living faithful lives. So the first part is what you should not do. And Paul tells us that we are to get rid of anger and wrath and malice, slander, and abusive language. These are the things that we waste time on, that we can get stuck endlessly in these things. It's okay to be angry sometimes, sure, but what we're talking about here is unhealthy anger that festers. Unhealthy anger that we never quite deal with in a real way, and we just let it grow and bubble, and we never talk to the people that we need to talk to about it, or we never quite figure out why we're angry and what to do about it, and it just lays there beneath the surface. That's the kind of anger that Paul is cautioning us against here. And then he says, he goes on in verse 9 to say, do not lie to one another, that this is equally devastating and dangerous. And then he says, you have stripped off your old self with its old practices, and you've clothed yourselves with a new self, being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator. So what he's saying is that all of those lies and the slander and the malice and the anger, that is our old self. That is all of the fallenness that came after the Garden of Eden. None of that is from God. None of that helps us to follow and lead godly lives, and none of it fills us with the peace and the joy that God really wants us to have. And so then we are led to an important question. We know that words can hurt. I don't really have to tell you that. But how is it that anger and slander and lies actually keep us from faithful living? Because this is what he says, that if we don't do those things, we'll be renewed in the image of our Creator. But if we do live in lies and anger and whatever, then we're actually being kept from God and kept from faithful living. So here's the way I see it. We have two basic commands. One, to love God in every way that we can and to love others. So one, to love God in every way we can, and two, to love others. And when we are full of those slander and lies, we are breaking our relationship with others. You see, even a little white lie, oh, you really don't look good in that shirt. That's the truth, what we're really thinking when we say instead a white lie, like, oh, sure, that looks great on you. And even that says to the person, if you really look at it carefully, it says, I don't trust you enough to hear the truth from me. And that's a break in relationship, right? Maybe it's just a tiny break. No one's going to lose a lot of sleep over that moment, but it's a tiny break. And those tiny things lead to bigger things. And pretty soon we're doing much bigger lies because the mistrust and the hurtfulness builds up so that eventually we're filled with all sorts of unholy words. And God's presence gets really hard to see in us. So we remember this from 1 John, that no one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us and his love is perfected in us. Do Do you hear that? That we can't see God physically. We see God in the way that we love one another. And so as I love you, and as I say to you, I really appreciate the way that you sing, or the way that you encourage others, or I really appreciate that generous act that you did. Those are words that build up. I really appreciate the peace and the patience that you have. Those are things that build each other up. And when we encourage one another, maybe when we just sit with one another during a hard time, that allows others to see God in us. That helps us to build relationships and love as God has called us to love. That allows God's love to flow through us and into others. But when we're filled with unholy words, when we're filled with evil and slander and anger and lies, that prevents others from seeing God at work in us. And so Worthington says that we need to be careful in our ways of speaking and careful to avoid slander. And then she talks about this, people who are under-communicators and over-communicators. And the over-communicator is one who just talks way too much and has lots and lots to say, and they're the ones who, when you try to say goodbye, they take like 30 minutes to say goodbye because there's, oh, and one more thing before you head out the door, right? Do you know those people? And then, so that's the over-communicator. The under-communicator, again, is one who says a little bit, assumes that you get the whole story, but maybe you didn't. They're always saying, you know what I mean, right? But maybe you don't. And then it leads to holes in communication, and you filled in the gap assuming you know what they mean, but you didn't, and then there's problems and conflict arises. So at any rate, I thought all of this was really interesting and kind of helpful for interpersonal relationships, but then I thought, I wonder how much we do that with God. It's interesting, right, to think about our interpersonal skills, but it's even more interesting to think about, for me to think about over and under communication with God. So here's what I think over communication with God looks like. Dear God, I thank you for all that you've done for me, and I have this problem, and I'm really worried about it, and I want you to talk to me about blah, 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 and I want you to help me figure out this, and I'm really worried about that, and we go on and on and on and on. But here's what we never do if we're over communicating with God. We never stop to listen, because certainly, and I want this to be clear, God cares about every detail of our lives. God cares about who we are, and we're supposed to lift up every prayer request we have, capture every thought, and make it captive for God. That's what we're called to do. But if we do all of this capturing, and we're always speaking to God, but we're never receiving, we're never allowing God to speak into our lives and into our hearts, then maybe we're over-communicating and not allowing God to speak to us. On the other side, there's under-communication with God. And I am sure that all of us do both of these at some point. Under-communication says, well, God surely won't care about this thing that I've been worrying about. It may be that I've worried for 8 weeks about this thing, but I don't want to worry God about it, right? And so we don't communicate to our God about whatever it is that we're worried about. And we wait until we get so desperate that there's just nothing left to do but pray, right? How many times have we thought that or said that? But that shouldn't be, and I know you've heard this from other pastors and teachers, that shouldn't be our last resort prayer. It ought to be our first resort and our middle resort and our last resort. It needs to be all of our lives that we spend praying. So don't under-communicate with God where we're not bringing our request to him, but don't over-communicate where you're only talking and never allowing God to speak into your lives. So as we wind down, ultimately we strive for good communication because it's helpful. It's just good practices for every part of our life. It makes our friendship stronger. It makes our work better. It makes our marriages better. It makes parenting better, and it helps with all sorts of things. We need good communication. But I think ultimately better communication helps us understand that we're loved by our Creator. and it helps us share God's love with those around us. And so as we try to wrap it all up, I think all of this is good stuff, but sometimes we need a picture of what good communication looks like, right? We know the goal, but we need a picture of the end result. So I want to go back to Colossians 3 and look at the end of it, the end of the passage that Lori read for us. It says, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion and kindness, humility and meekness and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against one another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. Do you see the community building here? Do you see the way that we're pouring into one another for the community of faith? And then above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. This is what faithful living looks like, Christ-like living that's full of community building, that's pouring in and loving others and allowing God to love us. This is what we're called to do, to practice good communication, to be full of compassion and humility and meekness. About a month ago, I attended a meeting, and the leader of the meeting asked us, we were all gathered there, he was trying to do this community building exercise. He said, who is it, name a person who is an example of faithful living? Who is it to you that best embodies Christ? And he gave us a few minutes, and I'll tell you, lots of names flooded my mind. I had lots of really great Sunday school teachers and mentors, friends who've stuck with me in dark times. And I had all of these names flood my mind. The one that came to the top first was my grandpa. And we were supposed to write a few words to describe that person. So I wrote down patient and kind and loving and gentle. And then I started to think about all of those other names. A Sunday school teacher, a seminary roommate, all sorts of different people. And they had, oddly enough, the same words: kind, loving, wise, gentle. And then I read those words from Colossians. I went back and I read them: compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, patience. And I realized these are the words that help us know that we are living Christ-like lives. That when I thought about the person who best embodied Christ for me, they were living out those words. And so I think that when we seek to be good communicators, again, it's not just about trying to help everybody like us or trying to get along. It's about showing others who God is. Because as we put on compassion and kindness and patience and love, we become more and more like God, and others notice. I certainly noticed those qualities in the people I thought of. And I'm guessing that you notice those things too. Probably someone who embodies those qualities led you to be in this place today, that led you to say, I think God is real. So our challenge then is to cast off all the slander and the negative words and put on Christ instead. We do all of this, of course, because our Father up above is looking down in love. And so we teach our little mouths to be careful what they say. Let's pray together. Gracious and loving God, we thank you so much for all that you are and all that you do.